All right, I have 11:30 Central Time, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we have a lot of great information to share today. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Brigid Bright, and I'm the Associate Executive Director for CASE. And CASE is the Council of Administrators of Special Education. This webinar is open to everybody for the good of the field. So if you're not familiar with CASE, I would ask that you check us out online, www.casecec.org. We routinely offer free professional learning events for members, and then instances like this, wide open for everyone to share great information and resources for special education. One of our great partners is joining us here today, Richard Capone with Let's Go Learn. We're very excited for him and his team to share with us today and increase our learning around building strong behavior systems. And as a former director of special education, I know the importance of having those strong behavior systems, and particularly now more than ever with the needs in our field. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Richard Capone.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Bright. So I just want to also re-emphasize that CASE is an amazing organization. If you're an administrator in special education, you need to join CASE. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? There's so much that you need to do. There's so much pressure in your position. So it's a great organization to be a part of. And we're really excited to be endorsed by CASE as well. We went through a rigorous process where they looked at our platform and our tools, and that's why we have partnered with them so much. But I just want to first of all say, you know, let's go learn. We've always focused on the academic side of the MTSS triangle, right? Which with hardcore present level diagnostic assessment, SDI. But today we're really we've launched not today, but a little while ago into behavior. And with Aimee and Aimee, you're going to learn so much. Aimee Dupree has a wealth of experience being a former special education EC director, being a principal, being an administrator, and then of course Aimee Adams having amazing experience as a district coordinator across 46 schools, bringing behavior services and autism services. So what you're going to see today is you're going to overcome that blank page syndrome, right? Where you have a blank page, you're like, what do I do? How do I start? They have so much practical experience that you're going to learn, what do I do to kick this off at my school or district? And I think that's a really important thing because we can learn stuff, but it's very hard to know how to operationalize it for your particular environment. And that's what we're trying to do today. Now, on a positive level, we are also working with districts and schools outside of webinars where we'll go out and help you in whatever capacity you need. Behavior is a huge issue, as you are probably aware, and that's probably why you're here today. And we're here to provide that expertise as well as technology tools. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to both of them, Aimee and Aimee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, um, for that introduction. As he said, I'm Aimee Dupree, and I'm the Director of Partner Success for Let's Go Learn. And talking about behavior is something I've done as a teacher and as a school administrator and as a district administrator in special education. And my partner here is Aimee Adams, and she has a wealth of experience, as Richard said, with that hands-on, boots on the ground, training staff in all elements of behavior and intervention and data collection. And together we hope to get you started today with where do we start with operationalizing behavior systems in our district. So this is a three-part series, and we're going to talk today about how to know where to begin. So hopefully at the end of our time, we will have provided you some connections between the MTSS framework and behavior, the importance of assessing core systems in your building, just like you assess core instruction, core behavior systems. And then understanding the importance of evaluating these core behavior systems to better what is happening within your building as far as student outcomes. So, how to know where to begin. And this is really moving from knowing that something needs to be done to doing what needs to be done. And with behavior, it is often a challenge. Things are pretty much fine until they're not. And we spend a lot of time as school leaders and district leaders focusing on academics. And It is the behavior, though, that often provides those obstacles for us and those challenges. And we get a lot of information from a lot of sources. We have parents who call us. We have teachers with issues in their classroom trying to focus on that instruction and curriculum piece, but the behavior challenges overshadow that at times. We have student data with suspensions and office referrals. So we get a lot of information coming in every day. And as school leaders and district leaders, we field that information every day. We come in with a great focus of focusing on curriculum and instruction, but somehow that behavior, it seems to overtake us. So ultimately, we know that something needs to be done, but knowing what to do and where to start, that becomes our hurdle. So once we learn that, then we are at this knowing and doing gap. So we know we need to do something, but what to do about it becomes the gap and the obstacle. So all of the behavior that we get is really on this knowing side. We have all of our suspension data, all of our in-school office referral data. And we can stand around and talk about all of the issues, but that is really just admiring that problem. And that pressure continues to build and the behavior doesn't stop. So what we want to do is help focus districts and schools on finding that clarity for change. And so we help identify what is working and where your individual school or district gap is, and then how to create action to move over that gap and into some systemic change that really positively affects your students and your staff. So as leaders, when we say we're going to change, there's a lot of energy around that, and people get excited because they're like, "Whoo, the behavior obstacles are going to go away for us." But the work is really hard, and we're asking our staff to reframe their complete understanding about behavior. And reframing is very difficult. And so what we know is that people want a program or a script that's an easy fix that often mirrors what they know and what they're used to doing or what they've always done. And they think of that as that magic wand. And that magic wand seems easy, but those magic wands, they don't exist. And so what we're really looking at is understanding the shifts that are needed. And that requires that innovative thinking. It requires us to think of doing new things vastly different from how we have traditionally approached behavior. And when you frame it in those terms, when you start thinking about innovative practices and simply changing how we approach it, you're speaking about making a paradigm shift. And what is a paradigm shift? Well, it is trying not to do something marginally or incrementally better. You're looking at things that are fundamentally different. They're going to have that huge exponential impact on your staff and on your students. And that is hard to do. A paradigm shift is not a magic wand. It truly is incremental change. It's change. So if you think about what Steve Case here, the founder of AOL, when he was thinking about creating AOL, he had to think about the requirements of communication and how we receive information. And he transformed what we do as a society and how we communicate with each other when he founded AOL. And when you think about making that type of change with your school or with your district, it becomes almost overwhelming. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is where to start, because paradigm shifts are difficult and they're often met with resistance. We simply want to be able to tell students the rules and hope that they follow the rules, but that's not the reality anymore of how behavior works. And so fundamental change is what is needed to address that tidal wave of information. You know what the hurdles are and who will be your resistors, but the challenges you face, you've got to do it anyway. And so we're here to support that today.
So behavior is learned. These statements are going to often be what you see happening in your building when a paradigm shift is occurring. Your staff will understand that behaviors are learned, so that means that it's hard to override what's happening in that home environment. Behavior change takes time because it was learned over a period of time. Behavior, even bad behavior, is communication. No student comes to school wanting to fail. Students come to school wanting to succeed. Some of them just do not have the skills to communicate effectively verbally, to engage in de-escalation skills. So the behavior is that main attention grabber instead of using that positive communication. Behavior influences behavior. So how we behave as teachers and administrators in our interactions with our student influences our student's behavior. And the behavior of our student impacts our adult behaviors as well. It's a flow that moves and shifts between all individuals in the room. All behavior has a function. Perhaps it's to escape a task demand. Perhaps it serves as a form of communication. Perhaps it's a way you gain access to a preferred person or a preferred location or activity. But that behavior serves a function for you and serves a purpose. Maladaptive behavior is the result of a skill deficit. It's no different than an academic skill deficit. This is the second, probably most important paradigm shift that a teacher could make. The most important shift that they could make is that teaching is required to address a behavior challenge. So, how do we answer behavior challenges in our classrooms, in our schools? We do that through teaching, just like we would answer a reading challenge or a math challenge that a student would have in our classrooms or in our schools. We address those challenges through teaching. So everyone has some version of a paper system in their buildings that staff use to either make office discipline referrals or to request additional support on a student or to start to communicate what we do with the student or what's going on with the student. At times, we start to get processes put into place where there's a process of going through those pieces of paper and checklists and ensuring that they're compliant in some way. But where we really want to land is at performance implementation, where those systems are delineated by their positive data outcomes over time. So where we're really assessing the fidelity of our implementation model, and we're using the data that comes via that assessment to change how we do business and inform our pattern in practice. So where do we start? Where do those data-informed decisions start? Well, they start at the core, just like they do academically. Are we meeting the needs globally of 80% of our students? Is what we do for everyone meeting the behavioral needs of 80% of our student population? Do we have maybe 15 to 20% of our students who may require supplemental intervention that we can kind of intervene as a cluster or a small group to help support skill building so that they can come back down to having their needs met at the core level of support? Are only 3 to 5% of our students exhibiting intensive needs, where we've really got to start to individualize the support and the instruction that's required in order to have that student start to come back down into the supplemental level or back to core? It's the same as we think of when we think of academics.
So this is where our paradigm shift happens with our behavior triangle. So when you think about students who have issues with reading, we intervene. When you think about students who have issues with math, you're going to intervene at that tier 2 level, at that tier 3 level. But when students can't behave, we often just turn to discipline, and that becomes our first response. And so when we talk about a paradigm shift, we really talk about looking at the MTSS framework with the same lens that you do with academics. So in tier 1, yes, that is the core, and that's where we're looking at that 80% of our students respond. And yes, tier 2 is where we're looking at students who need a little more. And yes, tier 3 is that intensive level where students need a lot of adult intervention, not an adult, a lot of different adults intervening to support them with their behavior instruction. But what you have to start with first, and this is the bridge between the knowing and the doing gap, is looking at the systems that are in place. So when we talk about thinking about what's happening at core, I don't just mean the core systems at the core level. I mean your core systems at tier 2 and your core systems at tier 3. So the way we like to break that down to support operationalizing this in schools is to determine what your core behavior systems are. Maybe you have a behavior matrix. Maybe you use PBIS. Maybe you use some SEL. Whatever the components are of core behavior instruction in your building that everyone follows. But what are the core systems at tier 2? How do you know when to transfer a student from tier 1 to tier 2? And how do you know when to transfer a student from tier 2 to tier 3? On the academic side, that's using data. On the behavior side, it should also be using data. And again, this starts to really get at that paradigm shift and that difficult work that teachers have to consider, and teams. If you do not have a behavior team in your building, a problem-solving team that looks at behavior, that's one of those core systems that has to be in place for tier 2 and tier 3. And once you've determined all of these elements, then you have to teach them. And you have to determine who's going to do the instruction and for which groups. Because all of your stakeholders, not just teachers, but teachers and students and parents, need to be invested in behavior expectations and in that, as Amy said, how we do business in our building. And once you have all of those things in place, they've been taught, then you go through implementing them. And that's where your data collection starts, truly at that core. Does everybody speak the same language? Do we have the same processes and procedures across all grade levels? And if those things are functioning well, then you know you've got fidelity of data when you start getting office referrals. So everyone has a calibration and understands when we say a major office referral or a minor office referral. And how do we ensure that those are across all classrooms, across all grade levels defined and used, implemented? So those are big pieces of thinking about behavior, just like you do academics. And then thinking about tier 2, when you engage academic instruction in tier 2 for intervention, what does that look like on the intervention side for behavior? Who are your folks who have those skills in your building? It comes down to really knowing your staff and leveraging the talents of the folks that you have in the building for behavior interventions, just like you do for academic interventions. And then by the time you get to that tier 3, really understanding how to review data and intensity data, frequency data, that making sure that you have the right interventions for students in case and the right data collected, in case you need to continue to move them forward for special education. We don't want this to become the pathway to special education, just like you don't want that for academics. The hope is that the intervention moves the kid back down from tier 3 to tier 2 or tier 2 to core. And so again, thinking about how to make those things functionally happen in a building requires that analysis of systems in your building. So when you're thinking about that, what are your systems? What are they? What do you have in place? You probably have some things in place, but not all things in place. And then of the things that you do have in place, who teaches that? And when do you revisit that throughout the school year? We don't want to just talk about the matrix in August. We want to talk about the matrix 180 days of school. And then how are they implemented and how are they monitored? Most importantly, who monitors the fidelity of implementation to make sure that we don't have a grade level or a couple of classrooms who are responsible for the majority of the office referrals? How do we know that the office referrals that we're getting are based on fidelity of implementation of our core behavior practices. And then lastly, how do these things become sustainable? How do we ensure that we have systemic sustainability in our buildings so that we're not reinventing the wheel every year or not being responsive, reactive? We want to be proactive, and that's where sustainability comes in. So there are two types of behavior that impact two types of data, that impact behavior. So we get student data. We know we're going to have suspensions. We know we're going to have office referrals. We know that we're going to have major office referrals and minor behavior incidents. We know that as we move through the tiers, we're going to start some intervention data collection. And we know that we might have some special education referral data. Are the students that we're referring to special education, are they placing or not? And if they're not, that is indicative of the fact that we don't have the right interventions happening back in that tier 3 and tier 2 level. And then the number of students that we have in tiers. So all of this is student behavior data, but it's really a two-way street. As Amy said, behavior influences behavior. So staff contribute a lot to this student data. And it comes down to, what does the classroom environment look like? Do we have things set up for the success of students? And what is our school environment like? Is the climate that we all are following the same rules in the same way every day, and that we're acknowledging positively the interactions that we're having with our students, and we're really focusing on the positive behaviors that are happening and not just addressing those things that are the maladaptive behaviors, that we're really looking as a school to change that environment to positive acknowledgement. And then, do we have fidelity of implementation with these systems? Are we collecting data on students that across all tiers is indicative of the needs of the student versus gaps in classroom environment or school environment from staff? And are things done consistently? Do we see suspensions for the same behaviors in the same way? Do we have consequences that are the same across days and times, and not when we just get frustrated or put out with a student? And then, do our students and our stakeholders, our staff, our families, do we all have the same perceptions? Is data telling us that our behavior is fairly and consistently monitored and executed and implemented in our building? So perceptual data is important, but these data pieces are two-way streets. It is not just what the student is doing, it is also what the staff is doing. And those two pieces together inform the health of your behavior core. But it really comes down to, once you have these systems in place and this data collection process is happening, then how do you measure the health of your core? How do you know that these things are happening and you're not just simply relying on student data, but you're looking at core systems data as well? That's the big question.
So how do you measure all of that? We've just talked about a broad spectrum of potential answers and solutions and decisions that are made and implementation strategies. How do you know what the health of your core is? Well, you might be familiar with the FAMS or the FAMD or the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or our core behavior assessment tool. You need to have some type of measure to be able to look at those core components. So our core behavior assessment tool really assesses the health of the school's core structures in each of those tiers. In your tier 1, in your tier 2, and in your tier 3. We look at 56 different elements that comprise best practices for responding to student behaviors, and that is assessed across these 11 domains. The core components we look at are those school-wide core systems. So do you have a matrix for your school? Is that consistent across environments? Have you addressed what positive behavior looks like in the hallway, in your cafeteria? Has that been communicated and taught to your teachers? Has that been implemented successfully, or has it become a poster and you're in that process implementation where it's just kind of hanging out on your wall? Do you have school-wide problem-solving systems? Do you have a designated team that meets routinely to discuss our tier 3 students, our tier 2 students, that evaluates both individual student data as well as school level data to ensure that you're meeting the needs and the processes that you have in place are being implemented with fidelity and that they're yielding the results that you'd hope? Because sometimes we start something different, we start change, hoping to reach a goal or a target. And when we look at the data, we realize kind of missed our target. And we have to adjust as we move along. You need a school-wide problem-solving team and systems in order to be able to evaluate that. Do your staff and students understand? We oftentimes, as we support districts with strengthening the health of their core behavior systems, we find that the administration at either the district level or at the school level have really made big efforts at trying to introduce strategies or systems for responding to student behavior, and they've rolled it out. But then when it comes to the staff's actual understanding, how is it being implemented with fidelity in the buildings? There's a big gap there. So you need to look at some concrete evidence of your staff and your student understanding. Do you have those positive behavior expectations in classroom procedures? Do you employ standard operating procedures in order to ensure that behavior is being taught in your classrooms? It's being modeled in your classrooms. It's being rewarded positively in your classrooms. Are there high rates of opportunities to respond? The more engaged our students are, the less behavior that we tend to see happening. So are our teachers employing best practices in order to ensure that students have multiple opportunities to engage and respond, no matter what their ability level is? Is active supervision happening in the classroom? Is that teacher moving around the classroom, actively responding to using her adult proximity, some of the behaviors and the vibe of the class at the moment? Is there a continuum of consequences that's being enforced consistently and fairly? The only way to know if those consequences are being enforced consistently and fairly is to look at that data. And this component of our tool really dives into some of those specifics to ensure that you're not coming up with disproportionality, some small subgroups that are being adversely affected that you just didn't kind of realize. Is there a problem-solving process? When we have a student who is not responding to core interventions and supports in our buildings, is there a clearly outlined and operationalized problem-solving process to address those discrepancies in that student's behavioral capacity? Are we building capacity with our staff? Are there opportunities for professional development? Have we woven our behavior data and conversations and growth opportunities around responding to behavior into our PLCs? Are we helping to build that capacity in our schools, or are we relying on just our school counselor or our social worker or that one unicorn teacher who happens to just be good at doing behavior? We really want to grow everyone's capacity in managing it because it's everyone's responsibility to help support these students, just like it's everyone's responsibility to help teach these students. And are we routinely engaged in a process where we're really reviewing and considering how we're addressing the previous 10 components? Is there a process where we're looking at that student data and looking at our school data and making decisions based off of that data?
So why would you use the core behavior assessment tool? Well, you would do it at least 2, if not 3 times a year. We advocate for 3 times a year using this tool because at the end of it, it allows you to set goals with your team and prioritize areas that you need to focus on. Again, we're talking about 56 individual components for granular data for how well these systems are working in your building. So as you are starting this process 3 times a year, and as you get to that sustainability, at least 2 times a year. But when you do this, it allows your team really to get granular with fidelity and the fidelity of the process that's happening in your building. It also gives you an opportunity to review data with your teams and with your staff. We are great at looking at academic data with our school and looking specifically at our end of grade test results and those things that go on our school report cards. And we're really good as a school improvement team at analyzing those instructional components. But we really need to do the same thing for our behavior data routinely and start building that in as part of how we do business administratively within a building. And when you do that, then you're going to help your staff to stay calibrated on what those expectations are. That really tightens up the fidelity. And it also allows you to adjust in the moment. So if things are going well, you want to assess and ensure that they're continuing to go well. But if they're not, it's going to give you the opportunity to make those adjustments, to revisit, to reteach, to have some school-wide focuses for particular weeks in the year. That way you're not waiting for the end of the year when you see large suspension issues or disproportionality data. You don't want to wait for that autopsy data. It's the same as doing formative assessments on the academic side. You don't just simply wait for the end of grade test to tell you how well your students are doing. You're testing them and looking at them along the way, getting that snapshot. So you want to be able to do the same thing for what's happening in your building and what your staff is doing so that you can make these adjustments along the way. It also keeps your behavior systems solid. If everybody is calibrated and looking at it routinely and with intention, it helps create those sustainability opportunities so that you're not, again, reinventing the wheel, or that you're not acting reactively day to day or year to year, that you're really being proactive and you're just beginning to tweak. Schools that have really good academic processes in place have the correct alignment for sending students through to EC. And so when they are evaluated, children place. You want the same thing to happen for behavior. And you also want to ensure that your data outcome reflects what's best for students. So that means that you're addressing disproportionalities at the school level before those issues become district level issues. So if the triangle and the assessment tool work in concert together, so if you think about the MTSS triangle with for behavior, and you're using the core behavior assessment tool, that's going to give you a cycle, and it's going to help you really establish your MTSS framework. And so once your systems are in place, you're teaching your stakeholders, everybody gets on the same page, and then you're looking at implementation, and that gives you engagement. And what engagement does is it gives you data. So you should have data on major offenses, minor offenses, suspensions, interventions, the number of behavior intervention plans that you have in a building, progress monitoring data on students at tiers 2 and tiers 3. And these become points, checkpoints for engagement for the functionality of your systems. And that's telling you a lot about your students. It's also telling you a lot about your systems. And data is designed to evaluate your students for success in tiers. It's also designed to tell you the health of your practices, the core practices in your building. And so as you are doing those evaluations, then you have the opportunity to evaluate, repeat them if they're working, adjust them if they're not. And again, it creates that ongoing cycle, and it really aligns and calibrates your staff so that you're focused on one single set of expectations as opposed to everybody kind of doing their own thing. So when we think about paper implementation, that's filling out a document. And when you're filling out a document, that does not lead to sustainable practices for behavior intervention. It certainly doesn't improve the behavior of students. It's simply filling out that paper as a referral. And lots of times, if you have that process, that referral then may go to a guidance counselor or an administrator who then has a meeting with the student or hands out a discipline aspect of maybe in-school suspension or some other version of discipline, but that doesn't change the behavior of the student. So whether you're at the paper implementation stage or the process implementation stage, using the core behavior assessment tool of any sort will help move you towards that performance implementation. It gets everybody on the same page doing the same thing. And that is what in turn makes those shifts for your students in a really positive manner.
So I hope today that we have really helped you understand where to begin. You now know that it starts with a paradigm shift, with looking for changing some of those attitudes and the perspective and lens we take on student behavior, moving from a corrective lens when student behavior is maladaptive into an educative lens where we see those maladaptive students' behaviors as a teaching need. And then we start to create uniform responses to those gaps in the students' learning and understanding around behavior. We know that we need to use some type of assessment tool, such as our core behavior assessment tool, to really look at the health of our core systems across the tiers in our building so that we can have some data to help inform decisions on how we respond to and allocate resources toward addressing student behaviors and supporting our staff in feeling like they have the tools in their toolbox that they need to manage and handle behaviors inside of the classroom. That's where we start on March 4th. If you join us again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to start to organize for success. We'll come back for our final of our three-part series on March 18th and talk about using that data to really make those decisions across the tiers in your building. If we kind of got you excited about operationalizing behavior systems in your schools, let's go learn. Amy and I will be putting on 2 different learning opportunities, one in April in Phoenix and another the next week in April in Orlando on building those strong behavior systems in your schools. We're going to spend 2 days really diving into all of those 11 domains in 56 targets in helping you know what it looks like to be implementing with fidelity in your buildings. We work with school teams and provide lots of opportunities for you to assess your own school data and to leave with actionable plans in how we're going to start to create change and movement and then make that paradigm shift once you get back in your buildings. So we hope when you come, you learn a lot. But we also send you home with some really great tools in your toolbox, along with some great plans for really starting to be able to move those mountains and change our attitudes and perspectives on student behavior.
I think we got some questions too. So I was going to start asking some. So one of them, the first one is, how can I get access to the core behavior assessment tool to review it? And I think I know the answer. They can email you on the previous page. Maybe we can go back to that. We have your email addresses and they can email you and get a copy. So the core behavior, it's not necessarily proprietary in the sense that, I mean, Amy and Amy and has developed it through best practices, but you guys are welcome to see that. But also our goal is to
I don't
actually
know
have
if you got
tools to
that.
help implement it as well, right? You can have this great process, which you need to do, but then eventually you want to have technology tools that can help you. And that's what we're working on the backside.
Second to last
All right.
page. I apologize.
Here's a question. If we have programs in place, how does this impact where we start, right? So they already have a PBIS, they have parentheses, PBIS, Pandora, Cell, Leader, and Me. So if they have things in place, how does this impact it?
Depends on where your gaps are. So that's what the core behavior assessment tool helps you determine what's working really well. We recognize that people have things in place. You have PBIS, you're doing things to positively impact behavior in your school, but your outcome data, maybe you have a lot of suspensions, maybe you have disproportionality. If things are inconsistently happening, that's what the tool then helps determine. And that's where we start kind of where you are because everybody's in a different place with implementation and with understanding. So I don't know that it means we take away from what you're already doing as much as we support the fidelity of what you're doing and help you make the tweaks to ensure that everyone's calibrated and your data is yielding for students. And oftentimes that comes at that tier 2 level, quite frankly. We see that schools have strong core things happening where students are following the rules and doing what they're supposed to do, or they're on fire. And that is just indicative of a gap in that tier 2 area where we focus on.
I think one of the wonderful things about engaging with us in this process of operationalizing your school behavior system is that we don't ask you to fit into any type of cookie cutter program. We really come in and help to analyze the strengths of what you have going on, help assess and look at that data to find those gaps, and then help you figure out how programmatically and structurally you can address them. So it is not a one size fits all approach. And like Amy said, our goal is to add to what you have going on, not necessarily to ask you to reinvent the wheel or to do something radically different.
Question is, who needs to be on our behavior problem solving team? Sort of a broad question, potentially.
That is a broad question, and that is what we're going to address in our next presentation next week. We'll start talking about how to build those teams and what the function of those teams are. Generally speaking, you want to have some behavior expertise in your building, and by all means, an administrator. We have to shift away from the administrator or the guidance counselor being the only human who addresses behavior in a building. It needs to be a team and collaborative approach, and we'll talk about that next time in depth.
I think the most important takeaway for today on that topic is that you need to have a behavior problem solving team. Oftentimes when we start engaging with schools who have, maybe some weak core practices, or it's a situation Amy described where they're either okay or they're on fire, what we find is, they have a handful of adults who do a good job of kind of talking to each other in an informal way, and just knowing the kids that have problems. But there is a lot of power in turning it over into a team and formalizing that process of truly reviewing your students and their data.
Do you have recommendations for how to help other school and district leaderships
Mm.
understand how closely related academics and behavior are? And this is, for example, behaviors learned and taught like academics. That's a really good question, right? Because how do you rally the troops to fight the fight?
So that is what we talk about in these larger trainings that we do, specifically the ones coming up in Phoenix and Orlando. Yes, we spend a lot of time talking about the need to rally the troops and to start looking at behavior in the same lens as academics. And what we do then, and what has happened for us in the past is that as schools dive into that core behavior assessment tool and start, or districts for that matter, and figuring out where their gaps are, and we begin to plug in those more individual ways. And so we can tailor training to be responsive to what is and isn't happening at your district or in your building.
Oftentimes it's an adult gap in understanding that leads to some of those misperceptions of behavior. Some of our more rigid thinking that we hold on to around behavior, we can address and start to create some movement on through just education and understanding, the same as we do kid behavior.
Exactly. And that's how we tailor what we would speak to a staff or a team about. It's truly at that, it's where you are. It's meeting your ZPD just like you meet the academic ZPD of students.
I would argue this video is a great thing to share, right? Because I think a lot of people, like when I ask people, like customers, like what is your behavior framework? A lot of times the answer I get is it's PBIS, right? And so I think people think about behavior very siloed. They think about it as a disciplinary system or a program or counselors. And so actually sharing this with their colleagues is a great way because I think it's going to open up their eyes. Say, hey, there's a tried and true framework for this, right? That works. This works. So
Mhm.
who would not want to embrace something that they know works for other people? Yeah, I think this video is a great one to share. And this is not being gated. This will be a freely available webinar for everyone to watch.
And if they didn't make it to the first one, we've got another one on the 4th of March and another one on the 18th. So invite them along.
Right. All right, here's another one. In my role, I work on behavior core, but tier 2 and 3 are handled by other departments. How does this impact where I start? Suggestions.
So I don't know if you're speaking from a district or a school, I'm assuming a district level. But I would think about what your data is telling you. If you have core systems or things that you do and someone else does tier 2 and tier 3, and your data wildly suggests that you don't have fidelity of interventions, or you have an over identification of students in a particular behavior area, or you have students with autism who then are over identified as special education students because of behavior. There's a wide scope of things that we would ask you to look at. And so it comes back to one man cannot do this alone. And it really is a system of tiers that influence each other. And so, how well are you working through a cycle with additional folks to then address what your behavior is telling you your gaps are?
And you may have responsibility for, one tier of our pyramid, but finding those opportunities to collaborate and to share perspective with the individuals who are responsible, maybe for tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, is going to be really important. Just like you sometimes have to do some cross grade level
Mhm.
collaboration to understand, the continuum and scope and sequence of a particular subject. It's same thing with behavior. Go ahead and wrap that team around, and not that you don't remain kind of in charge of one particular tier, but making sure that we're talking to each other.
Exactly.
One of the quick questions is, can you share the PowerPoints? And yes, we'll be sharing the recording and the slides with everyone. They'll get an email. All right, tiers. Another question. What about addressing disproportionalities at the school level before they become issues? Can you speak more about that?
Sure. So when you think about disproportionality data that comes from the federal government, one of the things they look at is to see that you don't have an over-identification of a particular group of students in one bucket or the other. So you should look at that in your own building. So you should look at the number of students that you have referred for special education, regardless of the identification area, and make sure that you don't have it over-identified by one population, whether it's by an ethnic group or a gender group or any of that relative to your total population. Additionally, when you're thinking about disproportionality, you don't want to look at that suspension wise. So if you have a particular group of students who are consistently being suspended, whether it's by race or by gender or by disability category, then that right there is letting you know that you have some weakness in that tier 2 area or tier 3. And so when you think about disproportionality, you don't want things to be out of balance in any tier for any group for any reason at any time. But that requires teams to continuously look at data with the lens of fidelity of implementation. And that is truly a paradigm shift. Because often we want to say the kid has done the thing, we want to send them home or suspend them or punish them, and that's that. But that is not addressing the behavior. And to Amy's point through this presentation, maladaptive behaviors require instruction. So, how are we addressing that?
And I was going to say, and that's part of your core assessment, right? So they can email you and get that on paper and pencil. What is the core assessment supposed to span? And that's done at a site level. So it's going to be done at individual schools so you identify it. So if you have that framework in place, you're going to be monitoring and catching these things.
Yes, and so one of the outcomes that we find consistently when we start to use that core behavior assessment tool to in the data that is derived from it to inform decisions at a school-based level is it impacts disproportionality without even trying.
Yep.
It is a way to address that without even knowing you're really targeting it, without even really opening that bucket. We have just over and over and over again found that when you start creating equity, you're going to address disproportionality. And one of the ways you create equity is by using data and ensuring fidelity of implementation across, all of your classrooms, all of your settings, all of your adults in the building.
So there's one more question is what is Let's Go Learn doing in terms of technology to support this? And there's a great question. So I think first and foremost, the big effort is you, right? Rolling up the sleeves, learning about this and implementing an overall behavior plan and having all the derivatives, articulation plans here and there, blah, blah, blah. But I think what we're trying to do is to have technology to help make it easier, right? You don't want to be passing sticky notes. You don't want to be filling out forms. So we're going to have, we already have it, the core behavior assessment where teachers or a team can go in there and assess each site. That's something we have in our system already. It's in beta. And then in the fall, we're going to be launching an incident reporting tool so that you can start recording progress monitoring students and not trying to do something. Right now, I'd say that what's happening today is progress monitoring is more accountability. How many people were suspended? How many guns were brought to school? How many people were absent? That's post, right? We want to be more shifting it more pre, so it could be more predictive and help you prevent issues. And so we're shifting that to be a superset of data, right? The federal requirement is just there's a certain number of variables you have to report, but you really want to report and record a superset of data so that it can become preventative. And that is what we're trying to do is do the technology to support this paper human process you already have to put the hard work in and implement. So there's no way around it. Technology will support and make it sustainable, but you still have to go through the initiative. So, all right. I don't see any. I'm looking at a couple windows. I don't see any more questions. All right. Any last words, Dr. Bright?
Certainly. Thank you guys so much for sharing these great resources and actual tools to help shape culture around building strong behavior systems. I really look forward to our next session. As Richard alluded to, this session is being recorded and we will post it on the CASE website. So again, that is casecec.org. You look under corporate partners and then through free webinars, you'll find it there. We're going to be recording each session and they'll be housed there for about a month. So I really encourage you, if this has sparked interest in thinking, I really wish some other team members were on this call, check the website. I'm sure Let's Go Learn will be posting on their website as well, but use this information in this webinar series to really build some great systems within your district. So thank you again, Richard and Amy, for this information and joining us today. And we look forward to the next series.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.